Albert was born on May 19, 1870, in Washington as Hamilton Howard Fish. His father served as the captain of a ship on the Potomac River. However, the boy had no memory of his father because, firstly, he was often absent from home, and secondly, his father passed away in 1875. Hamilton's mother struggled to raise her 4 children as she lacked the means to provide for each of them. Consequently, Mrs. Fish made the difficult decision to place the youngest sibling, Hamilton, in the care of the St. Jesus Orphanage in Washington. In the orphanage, it became evident that strict rules governed the lives of the children, to which Hamilton had to adapt. Teachers frequently resorted to physical punishment, including flogging, as one of their many daily disciplinary measures. Hamilton's peers also subjected him to harassment and physical violence. It was during his time at the orphanage that the boy developed his masochistic tendencies. Over time, he developed a fascination for watching his fellow pupils being tortured by their older counterparts. He derived even more pleasure from being on the receiving end of violence. This peculiar predilection for cruelty marked the genesis of Fish's twisted psyche, making this episode in his life significant. After several years, Hamilton's mother secured a relatively well-paying job, allowing her to retrieve Hamilton from the orphanage. She was unaware of the traumatic experiences her son had endured there. Additionally, she refrained from probing him about his experiences, as Hamilton was not inclined to open up about his psychological struggles, choosing instead to internalize them for years. When young Fish turned 12, he befriended a slightly older teenager who worked as a mail carrier. Their friendship quickly evolved into a romantic relationship. Hamilton's older companion introduced him to the world of eroticism, explaining concepts like coprophagia, which deeply fascinated him. Young Fish devoted every available moment to visiting public baths, driven not by the therapeutic benefits of bathing, but by the opportunity to spy on nude boys. At the age of 20, Fish decided to relocate to New York City and pursue a career as a male prostitute. It was during this period that he adopted the name Albert. He developed a strong affinity for his new profession, deriving both pleasure and substantial earnings from it. Between his work and moments of recuperation, he sought out victims in the back streets of New York. Many years later, Fish admitted that it was in New York where he first began to kidnap and sexually assault minors. Albert's mother harbored suspicions about her youngest son's well-being. In 1898, she arranged Albert's marriage to a 19-year-old woman whose personal details are absent from historical records. She hoped that marriage would cure her son's peculiar inclinations. Mrs. Fish breathed a sigh of relief as Albert and his wife began to welcome their own children into the world, with as many as 6 of them being born. In preparation for his new responsibilities as a father, Albert Fish changed jobs to provide for his family and ensure their decent living. He found employment as a warehouseman, leading a calm and monotonous life. However, his criminal tendencies resurfaced after he was caught attempting to steal and subsequently imprisoned. In jail, Fish's homosexual interests reawakened. Upon his release from prison in 1910, Fish began working in Wilmington. The nature of his employment during this period remains undisclosed. Nevertheless, it was in Wilmington that he encountered a young man named Thomas Kedden, several years his junior. Albert initiated a sadomasochistic relationship with Thomas, which he claimed was consensual, although it is highly doubtful that a teenage boy willingly agreed to such an arrangement. After a few days of association, Fish took Thomas to his vacation home, where he subjected the teenager to 2 weeks of torment. One day, Albert castrated Thomas himself, dressed his wound, left him some money, and subsequently fled, boarding a train back home. Albert never saw Thomas again, and there are no definitive historical records regarding the fate of the boy. However, it is likely that Thomas bled to death. In 1917, Fish's wife left him due to his frequent absences from home for work, leaving him nearly destitute. Following her departure, Albert Fish descended into depression. In In subsequent testimonies, he claimed to have begun hearing voices instructing him to engage in various bizarre activities. He began to engage in self-mutilation, using various implements, such as needles. In 1919, Albert Fish murdered a mentally ill boy in Washington. His fascination with cannibalism grew, and he even began preparing raw meat for his meals. Since his ex-wife left their children in his care, he also fed them raw meat. Strangely, Fish was not known to have abused his own children, raising questions about why he targeted other minors while leaving his own offspring untouched. This remains unexplained. On July 11, 1924, Albert Fish coincidentally encountered Beatrice Keel, an 8-year-old girl playing in her front yard. He offered her money for sweets in exchange for helping him tend to rhubarb in a neighboring field. If Beatrice's mother had not arrived in time, the outcome of this encounter might have been drastically different. Despite this, Albert attempted to ambush another innocent child, circling the Keel farm. However, on this occasion, John Keel, Beatrice's father, was present and successfully chased away the intruder. Nonetheless, Albert Fish was undeterred by his failure and vowed to find another victim in the future. On May 28, 1928, an advertisement by Edward Budd seeking a farm helper was published in the newspaper. Albert Fish responded to the ad and soon arrived at the Budd family's home, introducing himself as Frank Howard. There he became acquainted with the Budd children, Grace and Edward, aged 10. A few days later, he requested permission from Mr. and Mrs. Budd to take Grace to his sister's birthday party, which was to include other children. The Budds, having no reason to suspect the pleasant man, consented. This marked the last day the couple saw their little daughter. On February 6, 1930, Fish entered into another marriage, but his wife left him after just 1 week. Shortly thereafter, the police arrested a man named John Edward Pope, suspecting him of Grace Budd's abduction. An innocent man spent over 100 days in pre-trial detention. How was Albert Fish finally arrested? In May 1930, Albert sent a letter to Mrs. Budd in which he described in detail the murder of Grace, including the day he requested permission to take her to the birthday party. The letter also contained disturbing admissions of cannibalism. Albert Fish was swiftly located by the police. Initially, he behaved calmly, but suddenly attacked officers with sharp instruments in his possession. While in police custody, he confessed to the murder of Grace Budd, although he claimed his initial target had been the girl's brother, Edward. Despite Albert Fish's assertions of mental illness, they did not prevent him from facing the death penalty. The court sentenced him to execution in the electric chair. Upon learning of his impending execution, Albert expressed anticipation, believing it would be the greatest pleasure of his life. This strongly suggested that his masochistic tendencies were genuine. Albert Fish was executed on January 16, 1936. Remarkably, the first attempt at electrocution failed, requiring a second procedure. During the autopsy, it was discovered that Albert Fish had dozens of metal needles within his body, which had disrupted the flow of electricity during the initial execution.